Hello and welcome to the second annual Regional Council Summit. My name is Ali Jang. As one of the BBF regional managers, alongside my regional council colleagues and BBF staff, we want to say thank you to the over 200 people that registered to attend the Regional Council Summit 2022, and to welcome you all here during a 90-minute learning and sharing together. Please introduce yourselves into the chat, and if it's okay with everyone, this meeting is being recorded and then will be posted in our BBF YouTube channel. So at the end of the meeting, we invite you to please complete a short survey as an evaluation of the event. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Executive Director of BBF, Dr. Morgan Crossman. Dr. Crossman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. As Ali said, I'm Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director of BBF, which is Vermont's Early Childhood State Advisory Council. And I'm really thrilled to do just some brief opening remarks for our second annual Regional Council Summit hosted by our regional manager team. Again, if you're just coming into the session today, please introduce yourself in the chat. We're really excited to have you here. And even though we don't have a slide for it, it is our practice at BBF to do a mindful moment at the start of each session. So I want to ask you just to take a very brief pause at the beginning of this meeting and do one thing, any one thing that'll make you feel more present today. Is it going and getting a cup of tea? Is it using the restroom? Is it stretching? Is it deep breaths? But do that one thing for yourself before we get started. My one thing was a cup of tea. So I am feeling ready and present to start the day today. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is our agenda for the day. I'm going to do a very brief overview of the BBF network, really to show a spotlight on our regional councils, to highlight the important and critical work that's happening at the regional level. I will briefly share a little bit of data on mental health and resilience, and that is just a very quick preview of what you'll see in the State of Vermont's children next month. But again, really wanting to anchor us in how we use data to inform decision-making and policy. And then you will hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Jillian Boudreau, who is a licensed clinical psychologist, a school psychologist, an author, and just an incredible speaker who is going to focus on autism, anxiety, and trauma today and really give a unique perspective to us. We're going to end today's session with a networking opportunity for folks to really get into breakout rooms and discuss what's happening across the state related to mental health and resilience. I also want to take a very quick moment to introduce and thank our 4 regional managers at Building Bright Futures. We have such an exceptional team who's working alongside all of you within regions and bringing together over 200 people on a monthly basis to support the identification of needs and challenges and barriers related to kids and families. So just wanting to express appreciation for this team, but also all of you who are on the ground working with kids and families. I hope that what you see from today's session is that you are the inspiring, innovative leaders and experts on the ground who are able to identify the needs of kids and families, to elevate family and community voice, and to really make sure that our decision makers have the information they need to inform policy and decision making. And before we move into that network overview, I just want to share a quote from one of our legislators from our most recent State Advisory Council meeting that really shows and is reflective of the work of our regional councils and the importance of that work. So this is a quote from Representative Jessica Brumstead at our November 2022 State Advisory Council meeting. And she said, "We, being the legislature, are paying attention. The work that you're doing in the regional councils throughout the BBF network is having a huge impact on our decision-making as we move forward. We're talking about it all the time, and I can't say enough that we are listening." It's really important for you all to know and to be able to hear that and not to just take it throughout today's session, but really think about how you are serving as advisors, as this foundation in the BBF network and what that means to inform decision-making. So thank you all. So for those of you who are newer to our network, just wanting to kind of give this overview so you understand the roles and the responsibilities that everyone on this call, over 100 participants right now, what you're playing in this role that you're having in the early childhood system. So on the left side of the screen, the BBF network is committed to really focusing on the well-being of children and families. And at the base of our network, using evidence and data at all times as this foundation to understand how to move forward the work to better support kids and families. We have 12 regional councils across the state. These entities are touching every corner of our state and really serve as this foundation for our network. They are the on-the-ground experts and the key mechanisms to really say, here are the challenges, the needs, and successes. They're coming together on a monthly basis to problem solve and strategize, and then elevate those challenges and successes to our decision makers. And one thing that I also think that people don't know about our network is that we are one of a really incredible regional council network in the country. So the rest of the country is really looking to Vermont and saying, wow, how can we replicate this idea of having on-the-ground experts come together to strategize and elevate, and how could we create regional council networks? So there are other states who are moving towards this, but they're really looking to us to say, how do we do this well? What does it mean? And how can we be thinking about it at this national level? The next level of our network is our strategic plan committees. So we have 7 VCAP committees who are really honing in on the specific policy topics and thinking about how we monitor our strategic plan as a network. And then the 23 member governor appointed state advisory council. And this is the entity that is setting annual priorities and using everything they hear from the network to inform recommendations to endorse on an annual basis. We also bring together what we call the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, and that is the public or the agency leaders that serve on the State Advisory Council, and their job is really to take everything they hear in this network and figure out how internally in state government we better align and communicate and connect and integrate our system. And then the policymakers. It's the legislature, the governor's office, the administration, our federal delegation, and really making sure that they have what they need to inform decision-making. So that network is over 450 people that are coming together on a monthly basis, starting with our regional councils. And so one of the really amazing things that we think about when we think about our regional councils is the unique and the variation and how different the needs and challenges of families and communities are. And so what we see in this map on the screen right now is on an annual basis, our team works to help regional councils identify their top 2 priorities by every region. I think one of the most important things to take away from that process is that it is challenging. There is never a way to capture everything that kids and families need in 2 priorities. And so our regional councils have a really hard job in being able to identify the top 2, and it's not everything. It's not all of the things that are needed in at any given time. Another key takeaway is that there are some unique priorities, but there's also shared priorities across the state. And one of those shared priorities this year is mental health and resilience. And that's the theme of today's session. So what you're seeing on this screen in terms of the priorities going down to recommendations is that we have this process through the network for how we get from identifying priorities to making recommendations. So the first thing you're seeing on the screen is that 9 out of our 12 regional councils identified mental health and/or resilience as one of their top 2 priorities in 2022. When we think about what we know about our data, I'm choosing 2 indicators from the state of Vermont's children that you'll see more about later, but we're seeing an increase in the number of children with mental health conditions, including behavioral or conduct problems, anxiety, and depression. And we're seeing that increase from 2018 to 2021. So that's 13.8% of Vermont children between the ages of 3 to 8 experiencing one of those conditions. We're also seeing a rise as we're seeing that rise in needs, we're also struggling with a workforce crisis, right? And so what our 2022 data suggests is that 1 in 5 positions in our designated agencies and our specialized service agencies was vacant in the past year. So what did our network do to think about the data that we had and what needed to be done? there was a whole bucket of state advisory council recs on responding to mental health challenges faced by kids and families. And I'm not going to go through them, but I'll ask Anna, our policy director, to put the link in the chat to our recommendations focused on recruitment, reimbursement rates, and investing in training and support around trauma and resilience. So again, just wanting you to see that there are so many different levels of our network. And this is an example, starting with our regional councils, of how we are tackling big challenges that kids and families are facing. So thank you for all the work that you are doing. It's making a really big impact for kids and families across the state of Vermont. And I'm going to turn it over to Linda, one of our regional managers, to introduce our keynote today.
Thanks, Morgan. My name is Linda McNowitz, and I am the regional manager for Caledonia, Essex, Lamoille, and Orleans counties. And today it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Jillian Boudreau, who is a licensed clinical and licensed school psychologist. And many of you may know Jillian from her work with the Vermont Higher Ed Collaborative, providing professional development for educators around Vermont. So thank you for joining us today, Jillian. I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you all. It's really wonderful to be here. Dr. Crossman, I became so tenderhearted when I heard you presenting. So Vermont is very much my professional home. I've been working in Vermont schools since 2010. Y'all are really my people. And as as virtual has become more possible, and as things have grown a bit in recent years, I've also had the opportunity to begin exploring school systems in other states and across the country. And it really is true. Y'all are doing something so special in Vermont. And it's now such a gift for me to get to present to my Vermont people, because a lot of what I'm talking about, I think y'all already really get. And so my hope in what I share today is that you will feel validated and maybe even inspired as far as the incredible work you're already doing. And maybe I can give you some new words, right? Or some new terminology or ways to sort of describe and just continue to disseminate the amazing work you're doing. As you meet with new families and new kids. But mostly I hope that today kind of feels like a celebration of everything you're already doing. And I'm really grateful to get to be here with you today. A million years into this pandemic, and I still have to say verbally when I'm sharing my screen. So here we go. So basically I am a school psychologist and a clinical psychologist. So the joy of my work is getting to bring over clinical principles that get used sort of in the therapy room into the educational space, right? And so especially when, like you all, we're lucky enough to be getting to work with small children, which is when a lot of those psychological structures are getting formed. It's my greatest joy to sort of do some clinical and school crossover. So what all of that clinical and school crossover over the last 15 years has really taught me is that a safe brain is a smart brain. So anything that you are doing to keep yourself calm, to keep the children calm, to keep the vibe in your room calm is not only enough, but in many ways is from my clinical perspective, is the only true requirement to allow education to happen, right? So there is no development of course there is development because humans are very powerful and it's hard to stop development. However, I would say the main impediment to development in any situation is fear, tension, anxiety, disconnection. And you are in incredibly powerful positions to set the frame for the kids you work with, for the families that you work with, so that more and more calm can emerge. And the magic of the brain is that once we get calm in place, the brain flourishes on its own. So today will be sort of an exploration of what is all the deal with that. Now, this will circle around to the autism, trauma, and anxiety that was mentioned in the beginning. Because I see all of those as really stemming from the symptoms that come along with those stem from the same root, right? From what happens to the brain when there's fear on board, when there's agitation on board. So we'll kind of weave that through as well. But the beauty of this is the principle is very general. pretty much works for everyone and can be a great touchstone to keep coming back to, at least in my experience. So no surprise, right? We all know that relationships are really the key to safety and resilience. And that's something that I have been peddling as a school psychologist and then a clinical psychologist since I was very young. But as I have sort of lived into the work a little bit more, I've thought more and more about why that is. So I hope not to be just another school psychologist coming in and being like, relationship, but even to sort of unpack that a little bit. So if we think about how helpless a human infant comes into the world, right? We have to, if we think about evolutionary psychology, right? We are essentially the genetic descendants of those human infants who believed most deeply that connection was life or death. And I'll explain what I mean, right? So of course, infants are not consciously, verbally thinking to themselves, oh, I got to really maintain my connections. However, right, those infants that are wired to scream the loudest, right, when they need an adult attention, those infants that are wired to do all of those really adorable pro-social things that biologically get adults to move closer to them. These are the things that obviously keep an infant alive, right? So in our infancy, connection literally is life or death. And the more our most primal brain is wired to believe that, the more likely it is that we'll stay alive and pass on our genes. So what that means is that now we all as humanity are the descendants of many, 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 many infant primal brains that believed that. So no matter how old we get, there is always a very deep part of our brain that still believes that connection is actually life or death, right? So connection becomes necessary for optimal human functioning because without it, it becomes a survival crisis in our brain, whether we are 6 months old or whether we are 100 years old, because there's actually no real evolutionary purpose to shutting that off. Right? There's a lot of evolutionary purpose to us believing connection is life or death, not much to like soothing that belief in adulthood. So in fact, I see us all pretty much as tall children walking around having a bit of a survival crisis emergency on the level of the brain if we fall out of connection. So relationships are really the clearest way to communicate safety and security to our poor, sweet human brains, right? And so without that, very little else can happen because a brain that's thrown into an emergency cannot do very much else, right? It's just going to be focused on staying alive. We already answered the why. I always do that. So let's talk about the importance of basic safety. As I'm sure you know, as childhood educators, the brain essentially develops from down and back to top and front. And that is also the order in which our body will prioritize how it energizes the brain structures, right? So the super down and back is like brainstem stuff. So that's really just keeping the lights on. Are the lungs pumping? Is the heart doing what it's supposed to? Are we literally keeping this machine alive, right? And then as we get a little bit more development, okay, we do start to get some emotions, right? Some limbic system, some amygdala, but these are very primal emotions. These are still basically about staying alive, whether it is fighting off an attacker or like keeping the species going, right? There's not a lot of nuance here. Then as things develop a little more, okay, we get some memory, we get some verbal reasoning, wonderful. And it isn't until way up here, right, at the very tippy top and front of the brain, the last structure to develop, and also the first one to shut off at any sign of trouble, is the prefrontal cortex, right? So the prefrontal cortex is really the seat of most of what we are asking of kids in a society and in a school setting, right? So without the prefrontal cortex, there is no problem solving, there is no perspective taking, there is no empathy, and there is no curiosity. So all of those things that we're expecting of ourselves and of kids all the time are actually coming from this hugely flimsy, extraordinarily luxurious part of our brain that simply will not turn on. There's nothing we can do to get it to turn on until safety is really established. Because if safety is not established, our brain is going to say, no, 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 no. We're going to focus on all this survival stuff. There's no time to be shooting juice up here, right? Like empathy and curiosity are not going to help me, fight off this bear. So basic safety is incredibly important to unlock all that stuff. So when we're feeling basic safety, which ultimately for me ends up meaning we're feeling more love than threat. I think the human nervous system is always sort of appraising love versus threat, love versus fear, right? And so if we've got more love than threat in the space, we can unlock problem solving, perspective taking, empathy, and curiosity. Under stress, any person, be it me, be it a 2-year-old, is thrown out of basic safety and into survival mode, which will temporarily block those non-emergent but massively important functions, right? So that's why if I'm having a harder day, I am not as interested in new ideas, and I'm probably a little bit more self-focused and slower to solve a problem well. On the other hand, if I'm having a super chill day, oh my gosh, I might feel like I've never been smarter in my life, right? And I imagine you may have had sort of similar experiences in your own mind. I belabor this point because you will probably run across parents who are really confused and at times indignant as to why a child who has demonstrated that they have a skill or a capacity is simply withholding it or refusing to demonstrate it the next day. Right. So I think this basic safety idea is really important to help us all remember our capacity, literally our ability to access prefrontal cortex functions is different day to day and depending actually on the level of threat versus love that we're experiencing. So it's not that kids are just refusing to do things that they could do. It's actually that they really can't on certain days. And if they can't, it's probably because we want to reassess what their experience is in that moment as far as love versus threat. Because chronic fear really messes with the brain. So I don't do as much of this anymore, but a big part of my job used to be psychoeducational evaluations in Vermont schools and in New York City before that. And so one thing I learned from that is that certain types of intelligence are pretty stable depending on the type of day a kid is having and depending on like the year that you evaluate them. But certain types of intelligence are incredibly state dependent, right? And so in particular, processing speed and working memory. So how quickly one thinks and also how facile we are at kind of holding information in mind to work with it, right? So holding on to a phone number, things like that. That stuff will go so quickly when a kid is under stress, but will also come back quite quickly when a kid is more relaxed. And so this happened early in my career. I learned that. And then it got me really interested in, okay, well, what else might fear and stress impact? And it turns out it impacts a lot. So there's a ton of data on this. But chronic fear does impact both cognitive and emotional functioning. So, we all have experiences of momentary fear. Sometimes I call that kind of falling off the balance beam of basic safety, right? So that moment when like, oh, it kind of feels like we've just missed a stair. Or like if you had any challenges getting onto the Zoom today, maybe you like fell off of your balance beam of basic safety for a moment, right? And then maybe now, okay, are feeling a little more re-regulated. We're here, we're doing it. Kids who are in, chronically stressful situations, they're spending more time often off of that balance beam of basic safety than they are on that balance beam of basic safety. And that's going to have more significant impacts as far as how often they're able to get up to their prefrontal cortex. And because the brain is such like a pathway and a practice-based system, the more we're off our balance beam of basic safety, the more we're blocked from our prefrontal cortex. Unfortunately, that can create a feedback loop where the harder it then becomes to get up to our prefrontal cortex. So because of that, chronic fear in particular has negative impacts on both cognitive and emotional functioning. Fear and anxiety significantly shrink executive function and the capacity for adaptive behavior. So executive function is a very big floppy term. It can actually mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think of it most generally as the muscle by which we can direct our attention and volition, and the muscle by which we can get ourselves to do stuff that is a good idea and will help us later or will help society, but isn't inherently rewarding in the moment, right? So planning, organizing, impulse control, thinking about your own thinking, right? These are all tasks that are like kind of hard, but kind of good for you, that require motivation. That too all lives in the prefrontal cortex, right? It's so weird that so much important stuff is in this like very flimsy treehouse of a brain structure that's hard to get to. So fear and anxiety also interact with neurotypes like ADHD and autism to worsen or even initiate symptoms, right? And so here's where the rubber can really start to meet the road from a justice perspective. I won't belabor this today, but sometimes I'll do whole webinars on equity as far as calm brain, right? So we really want to think about who is being prioritized in the spaces we're creating as far as who's going to have the easiest time staying calm. Because if we are creating a setting that is going to more often stress out, let's say a kid with ADHD, or let's say a kid with autism, right? If our system has been built by neurotypical folks without consult with folks with ADHD or autistic folks, right? Without sort of reading books about, okay, how can I change the sensory environment, right? So it's less likely to stress out folks with brains that may have, more awareness of sensory stuff. We're unwittingly stealing mental bandwidth from the kids who our space is not built for. Not because we're being malicious, but just because if we don't think about everyone's ability to access calm, and if we don't try to actually equalize everyone's ability to access calm, then we have not equalized everyone's ability to access their education, because we have not equalized everyone's access to their prefrontal cortex. This is a visual of that, right? So for those of us who are more visual learners, I did not make these slides, but I did make these captions. So down here at the bottom, and Linda, I don't think I did this. No, I think I did. I did send you the slide presentation, so that can totally be shared with folks. So they have these links as well. So Bruce Perry has been looking at sort of the sequential development of the brain, in the midst of trauma, in the midst of fear, things like that for a really long time. This kind of slide used to be pretty proprietary, but he did an awesome thing during lockdown and just made it all really open source public domain. So if you want a really deep dive on fear in the brain, this is a good link to do that. It's like an hour long, and these are some slides that came from that. So if you look over here, right, this is what's going on in a brain that is, I would say, in fear. Dr. Bruce Perry would say dysregulated. So this is like sort of a flock freeze kind of trauma arousal response. So in fear, what we've got is a low capacity for luxurious brain functions. So what you see the brain do is put a lot of energy, like 60% juice, way down at the brainstem. So the brain is really, in a way, the brain is really thinking about staying alive. It's putting a lot of energy toward making us breathe faster, right? Making the heart pump faster. It's also putting a lot of energy toward the limbic system and the diencephalon, which govern really survivally stuff. So there's a ton of energy in our emotional center, but it is not nuanced at all. It's really primal. It's just going to be about anger, desire, terror. That's all we're going to get. And it is not complemented by any sort of wisdom brain, thinking brain, prefrontal cortex treehouse, right? Because the neocortex up here is totally shut off. There's simply not enough energy, right? The energy is all stuck down in the survival parts. Now, if we look over here to calm brain, I love how we can see this flip, right? So now we've only got 10% down here in brainstem, right? The first thing basic safety does is it gets our brain to stop prioritizing literally just physiologically staying alive. Once that can go on autopilot, there's so much more energy to spread throughout the system. So now we still get actually even more energy in the emotional center, right up here in the limbic system. So we're actually able to access even more of our passion, but that's fine. And in fact, good, because it is partnered so beautifully with this 85% neocortex. So basically, when we get calm, the brain can take all the energy out of the lungs and put it in the prefrontal cortex. And once we have that, oh my gosh, then we can access our most beautiful, authentic humanity, where we are fully engaged in our wisdom and fully engaged in our heart. And that's where we can really do the work of our lives. And that's where our kids can do the work of their lives. So all that to say, right, when supporting young children, anxiety, fear should always be considered first as a potential contributor to a challenging emotional pattern or behavior, right? So often when I consult with teams around kiddos, folks really are engaged around, all right, let's figure out what is a can't and what is a won't, right? Because if it's a won't, then people can start to feel like, well, then that's defiance, right? And then we may want to punish that. But if it's a can't, right, then we want to get in there and sort of build skills. So what I love about this fear model is it really helps me to argue, as the humanistic psychologist I am, that people, I really do believe, are honestly doing their best pretty much all the time. And if we're not seeing somebody showing up super well, I think we can assume that that is a can't. And then it becomes our job to figure out, all right, well, where's the sneaky fear? Where is this person going down into their lungs instead of up into the treehouse of their prefrontal cortex? Because if we can ameliorate that, clear the blocks to that, then almost effortlessly, this person is able to become the best version of themselves again, because fear is just the block. So let's talk about that sort of in more concrete terms, right? I know that sometimes I can get really theoretical. So let's say we have a kiddo who's showing up with like defensiveness or reluctance to try, right? Like, this is stupid. You can't make me do this. This isn't going to be, I don't care about this, right? That person isn't inherently showing up as fearful, right? That person is inherently showing up as pretty cranky and oppositional. But the sneaky fear under that is usually a fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of punishment, right? So of course you're going to show up like you don't care, like this whole thing is stupid. If actually you're terrified that if you risk trying and fail, you will feel horrible or somebody will make you feel horrible, right? And you know, for kids who have come from tricky situations, that might just be adaptive. They might have really experienced that before. So if we can work on fear of failure, judgment, punishment, right? If we can build up connection, if we can build up a sense of you're safe here, suddenly we see a lot less defensiveness and a lot more willingness to try. Then there's worry. So worry is usually not such a long walk. I can usually get a team on board with the fact that worry is fear. But worry is sneaky in the sense that it's almost never what it says it is, right? So maybe you can imagine working with a child who was terribly afraid of flushing the toilet, right? Like couldn't go to the bathroom. The flush was way too scary. They were worried they were going to go down the toilet. We see this a lot with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. You might have found that you fixed that worry. And who knows how you did it? Maybe you brilliantly put like noise canceling headphones on the kiddo. Maybe you did a million social stories about how the toilet is our friend, right? You used all of your tools to suddenly help this kid not be so scared of the toilet. But maybe then you saw the worry pop up somewhere else, right? So maybe a few weeks later, oh, now they're really afraid of the slide. Okay, what are we going to do about the slide, right? Maybe you put a patch on that, but then it pops up somewhere else. So that kind of whack-a-mole worry situation usually isn't about what it says it is. It's usually about fear of the unknown, right? So in this toilet and slide example, right, it's also maybe a fear of surrender. Like that's a lot of like swooshing down. That's a lot of like losing control of like standing here on the earth, right? That is really scary. That's kind of an existential fear. We can all connect to fear of the unknown, right? And so if we begin to address those whack-a-mole worries with, how can we get this kid's nervous system regulated? How can we spend 2 minutes a day for 10 days in a row just hanging out with this kid in a non-structured way so they feel really connected to their educator? How can we build in sort of rhythmic practices, right? Like group clapping, group singing, group chanting, that will help them to feel more rooted in their community and rooted on this earth, so that the idea of like swooshing down a slide or a toilet no longer feels so threatening to them, right? That's where we'll often start to see the whack-a-mole worry relax. Then there's impulsivity, right? So sometimes we see kids who really struggle to wait their turn, really struggle not to like pinch their neighbor, right? Sometimes that doesn't look like fear at all. Sometimes that again looks like kind of a brazenness. But that's often a sneaky fear of losing out or helplessness, right? So to be able to contain ourselves, to be able to hold an impulse, to be able to wait, for one, we have to trust that there will be enough for us if we do wait, right? Sometimes impulsivity is a bit of a grabby energy that's like, well, I certainly can't wait my turn. What, you're passing around pencils and I'm going to wait for a pencil? It's not safe to do that. There might not be pencils by the end of it. I'm going to grab, right? And it can also be a reaction to helplessness. So sometimes if kids have been in situations where they are often made to feel helpless or powerless, maybe if home is tricky or things like that, an unconscious but classically common thing that a human psyche will do is called turning passive into active, right? So basically, if I've been made to feel powerless over and over again in my life, I probably am going to turn around and try to balance that emotional energy. So I'm probably going to end up trying to make someone else feel powerless, not because I'm a terrible person, but just because I'm a little kid and I have to get that powerless energy out of my body. And I don't know how to do that other than like being impulsive at somebody else. So again, the more we can build basic safety, mindfulness, rhythm, connection, these are the main ones, the more we can begin to see that impulsivity start to move. Then there's also trouble focusing and addiction. For kids the age we're working with, I usually see addiction in the form of screens, but we all know it actually is really an addiction sometimes if you take that screen and you see the withdrawal response. So, trouble focusing, zoning out in a screen, this is all a form of checking out, right? And that tends to be a fear of the present moment. So sometimes if a kid has experienced a lot of tough stuff in their life, their nervous system ends up being chronically kind of on fire, right? And so, for any of y'all, such as myself, who have had your own experiences with anxiety or depression or things like that, it feels bad. It feels quite physically bad to be experiencing emotional unwellness. And if that's what's going on, it's actually kind of a smart strategy to pop up out of that somewhere, right? Like, why would you want to pay attention to the present moment if you feel horrible? Why wouldn't you want to zone out in a screen if you feel horrible, right? So again, our job is to build up the basic safety of those kids who are like, pinging all over everywhere as far as their consciousness and their attention, because they're doing that because for some reason it's not safe to be here. And so helping them make their connections, their physical neutrality in their body, again, through mindfulness, rhythm, things like that, predictable routines, all of a sudden it becomes safe to land. And once we've landed, then we can pay attention. We can't pay attention until we have landed. And then there's tearfulness and aggression, right? So sometimes folks will say, no, this kid is like crying all the time. No, this kid is like raging and throwing chairs. Like, this isn't fear. This is clearly like sadness or anger. To that, I would say, yes. So the way I'm talking about fear is more molecular and more on the level of neurons, essentially. So I would say that fear is sort of the primal alert system that we get when the brain is like, better prioritize the lungs rather than the prefrontal cortex. And then different brains do make different meaning of that state of emergency, right? Some brains are much more likely to interpret that as sadness. Some brains are much more likely to interpret that as anger. Some brains will interpret that as anxiety. But the primal piece under it is a primary fear response. And so all that just to make my impassioned case that I don't think you can ever go wrong, at least entertaining the possibility that whatever you're seeing is probably fear. Even in the rare case where it's not, you have done nothing wrong. Because if we approach it as if it were fear, then what we do is come in and support and build safety and connection. That's never a bad idea, even if we're wrong, which I don't think we are. Whereas if it is fear and you don't treat it as such, that can be a real big problem. Okay, so I'm going to do just a couple more minutes as we talk about how fear moves through families and communities. I'm going to zoom through this a little bit because I always put more in than I can do. I want you to know that fear is contagious, right? And so here's how it can move in a family or in a community. And for some reason, I'm struggling with where your little boxes are. I'll try to move you. Okay. So imagine, if you will, that a caregiver might start to worry about what a kid might do, right? We all start to worry about, oh my gosh, is there going to be a behavior? How are we going to handle it? What's going to happen? When we do that, the caregiver can get into a fear state and can begin to act more like lean out, avoidant, I don't know, I don't want to create a meltdown, or more controlling, right? The caregiver can start to talk about like, nip it in the bud, I got to really watch this kid. Either way, the caregiver is now in more of a fear state, right? The adult is now losing access to their prefrontal cortex treehouse because they're like going down into their lungs. They're like ready for a fight in a way, right? Now, because emotions truly are contagious, I don't have time to make the case for that right now, but there's all kinds of data on emotional contagion. We're just animals. We really do physiologically catch each other's emotions, and especially fear is really jumpy. We catch that really quickly. So once a caregiver starts to get into fear and really trying to control or avoid this kid, the child is going to catch that. Their fear reaction is going to start to bubble up. They're going to sense danger. They're going to sense rejection. They're going to sense disconnection. That starts to become a mental emergency. Kid goes right out of their treehouse, right into the lungs. So yes, then we will begin to see challenging emotions and behaviors. And if we don't learn to diagnose the fear, we could easily just think that we were right? If we miss all of these arrows in between, we as the adult could be like, yep, I thought this kid was going to act out, and look, they did. Without realizing that, well, we had a big part in that because we lost our regulation. We lost our access to calm. We stepped out of connection with the student or the child or, our own child. And then we saw the behaviors, right? So instead, what we really want to do is get to where we spread calm, because calm is really contagious. So the last thing I'll leave you with is that calm spreads on purpose, right? So we need to access our own regulation. However you do that, I really like to meditate. Different things work for different people, right? So trying to come into the space with a kid already as calm as you can. Trying to set the intention to anchor to the present moment, because the present moment is the only place where the other people are. A lot of times we're thinking about the past or the future. That's not where the people are, right? They're only here. The kids are only here with us. So we have to actually be here, noticing the sensory cues in the environment, knowing how fast or slow our heart is beating, noticing whether our own breath is in our belly and our chest, right? We have to really be here in a visceral way. And then we have to make a connection on purpose, right, with another person. This works with adults too, but let's say it's with a kid. Maybe that is through eye contact if a kid can handle that. Maybe that's through a kind word if a kid can handle that. Maybe that's the hand on a shoulder. If a kid is really dysregulated, maybe that is actually just sitting in the space, consciously keeping our heart open and consciously sending them positive regard and well wishes, right? That works too, because the electricity of our nervous systems are so connected. Once we've got a rooted, calm adult, setting the intention to spread calm into the space, that is where kids can also come up out of their lungs into the prefrontal cortex, and everything can move. So thank you so much for entertaining my fear obsession today. And let us go to our breakout rooms.
Thanks so much, Dr. Boudreau. That was such great information. And welcome to everyone who was able to join us a little bit late. What would a Zoom meeting be without a little bit of a glitch? So thank you for being patient and jumping in with us. I am Darla Senecal. I'm a BBF regional manager. I cover Addison, Rutland, and Bennington County. We're going to use this next time in our meeting for a bit of speed networking. We'll break out into 4 different Zoom rooms, and you'll have a chance to hear from some additional information from Dr. Boudreau. We'll also hear from Courtney McCaig and Lisa Bozigan, Stephen Burbaco, and then Lauren Norford and Jen Whedon. So these are folks from around the state who are working hard to address family safety, mental health, and strategies to build resilience for children and families in their communities. So you'll have 10 minutes in each of these rooms, and then a new presenter will join you. So you will stay stationary, but your presenters will change. And if you have any questions, there'll also be a BBF regional manager or staff member in that room to help you out. So Dora, how about we open those Zoom rooms?
I'm just going to move some folks around. Thank you for your patience.
We'll be sending out the some information of the speakers and their contact information, as well as the regional managers and their information. And Ali, if you're back in the room, can you share the evaluation link in the chat? We'll also be sending that out in a follow-up email as well. And because due to time, we won't be able to have that large group conversation, but I really wanted to kind of task everyone, if you are connected to your regional council, to take, one thing, either an action item, a thought, an idea that you pulled from the breakout sessions, and connect that with your regional council. And again, we'll be sending out information. So if you aren't connected and would like to be, we can follow up with that as well. So yeah, thank you to our speakers and thank you to all for joining us today. It's been great. And, we value making these connections and more to come. So thank you for these partnerships and we'll see you soon.
Well, bye.
Thank you, everyone.